Hello class, today we're going to do chapter 4, section 6, isosceles and equilateral triangles. And our objectives today are just to use the properties of isosceles triangles and use the properties of equilateral triangles. So our first one says isosceles triangle theorem. If two sides of a triangle are congruent, then the angles opposite those sides are also congruent. So we look here, AC and BC are congruent. So if AC is congruent to BC, then the angles opposite, so angles 1 and angle 2 are congruent. So isosceles triangles is where two of our sides are congruent, then those two angles right below them are also congruent. All right, and then we have the converse. So if those two angles of the triangle are congruent, then the sides opposite those angles are congruent. So I can say that these two sides, because they are opposite from those angles. So if angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, then DE is congruent to FE. So either way we can go with our isosceles triangle theorem. The two sides are congruent, therefore the two angles are congruent, or if we see the two angles are congruent, then the two sides are congruent. All right, so let's put that to use. Here's proofs. Yesterday we covered proofs in class. So remember, we're just going to do two columns. So we have statement and we have reason. All right, so if we go ahead and look here, we're going to list our given first. So LM is congruent to LP. So I'm just going to make the markings for that. And our step 1 is our given. So we need to prove that angles M and P are congruent. And we talked about yesterday in class that corresponding parts to congruent triangles are congruent. So if we can prove those two triangles are congruent, we'll know those two angles are congruent. All right, so let's go ahead and look at that. We see LN is congruent to LN, and that's our reflexive property. Now we have two sides are congruent, and to be able to prove that the triangles are congruent, we either need another side, or we need to be able to prove that some angle in there is congruent. So we have our side, 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 angle, angle, side, side, angle, side, and angle, side, angle. So it needs to come from one of those four. While looking at it, I can't prove that that third side is congruent. And it doesn't tell us anything about the angles or if anything bisects. So I'm going to help you out with this one. So step 3, we're going to say that LN is drawn so that N is the midpoint of MP. And if we do that, we'll know that that's going to give us some congruent sides, I promise. So in 3, we can justify this by saying every segment has a midpoint. So if that's a midpoint, we know that that has now created two equal parts. So state 4 says that PN is going to be congruent to NM. So PN and MN are congruent, and we'll make that 3 lines. And that, because that's the midpoint, and that makes two sides that are congruent, so we'll just call that by the definition of midpoint. All right, so now I look and I have 3 sides that are congruent, so now I can state that my triangles are congruent. Triangle LNP is congruent to triangle LNM. And we just proved that it's congruent by side, side, side. Now that we've proved our two triangles are congruent, we can state that angle 6, or not angle 6, sorry, step 6, we can say that angle M is congruent to angle P. And that statement comes from that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And so we just proved that angle M is congruent to angle P. And that shows us that LM and LP are congruent also. All right, so find PN. So looking here, we see that my two angles are congruent. So then I know my opposite sides are congruent. So go ahead and come up with what is PN. Number 3 says find the value of Z. Now looking at it, I have two congruent angles, and so the sides opposite are congruent. So I see Z, so I can take 2Z minus 15 and that gets set equal to 9. Because if those two angles below are congruent, those two sides will be congruent. So bring those two problems back for tomorrow. Equilateral triangle. We've talked about this briefly before, but each angle of an equilateral triangle is 60 degrees. Because remember that all three angles add up to 180. So if each are 60, 60 plus 60 plus 60 gives us that 180. So a triangle is equiangular if or equilateral if and only if it's equiangular. So if angle A is congruent to angle B, which is also congruent to angle C, that's that transitive property we kind of talked about. I can say that if all three of those angles are congruent, then I know that all three of my sides are also congruent. All right, so equal angles means equal sides means equals angles. So go ahead and let's look here at this problem, problem 4. We have to find angle RP and then the measure of PR. Well, I see here that my two sides here are congruent. So then I know that these two angles over here are going to be congruent. So I see that angle Q is 60 degrees. So if I take 180 and minus that 60 degrees, I'm left with 120. 120 covers my last two angles, and we know that those are congruent. So I take my 120 and divide by 2, and I find that each of those angles is 60 degrees. Then PR. Well, I see that all three of my angles are congruent, so then I know that all three of my sides are going to be congruent, and so that is going to be 5 centimeters. All right, looking here at problem 5, I see some, let's see here, looking at both of these, I see that my two angles here and here are congruent, so that means the sides opposite are also going to be congruent. And I see congruent markings here and here. So that shows me that this side DF is going to be congruent to DE, and that my angles are all going to be congruent. So to find x, 4x minus 8 equals 4x minus 8. Nope, that's not going to get it to us. Well, we know that all my sides are equal. So what does that mean about my angles? All my angles are also equal. So if they're also equal, that gives me equal to 60. So go ahead and solve that for x for tomorrow. If you don't see that, please, please, please come tomorrow with questions on this so we could talk about it. Two of my sides are marked as congruent, so then that's easy enough to just set those equal to each other and solve for y for tomorrow. Here we have problem 6. Two of my sides are marked congruent, and then also I have angles marked congruent. So then there again proves that all three of my sides and all three of my angles are congruent, just like in problem 5. So go ahead and finish that one for tomorrow. Problem 7 says find the values of x and y. Here we see the two sides are congruent, so that makes it easy enough to set those two equal to solve for y. Finding x. Now that one side doesn't say it's 60. We don't know anything about if those two sides are equal. But I know my two sides are congruent, so that means these two angles are going to be equal. So think about that for tomorrow, and I want you guys to come with that solve for tomorrow. See you then.